Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as always, on the program today. And I just want to give you all a quick reminder that Justin Center as an organization is run by donors. We do need donors to continue to grow as well as to continue to sustain the things that we are currently doing and for a number of new projects. So we would ask that if you would have benefited from the things that we do, that you would go to our website, justincenter.org. You would help support us financially there, as well as supporting us in other ways. You can print out a PDF that we have that's a brochure that we give out to potential donors that explains who we are, what we do, why what we do is important, and why we are worth supporting. So if you know somebody in your life that you think would appreciate what we do and would see the value in that and helping support what we do, you can check that out. Go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page, and you can get all the information you need there. Well, one of the things that we do on Just and Sinner and with Just and Sinner is provide academic material, particularly through the Widener Institute. And one of the things that the Widener Institute does is we host a number of seminars. You can purchase those at justincenter.org as well. You can find the Widener Institute page. And we offer some courses through there as well. But we also publish theological papers, and we do that through essay volumes. We only have one out now, Justification, but we've got 3 of them that are currently in the works that are all very close to being done. So we have a number of these coming out in the future. But what I have for you on the program and the video today is a presentation of an academic paper. And this is a paper that I delivered at the Evangelical Theological Society in 2022. The theme of that conference was holiness, and I was asked to give a paper presentation on Luther's idea of the 2 kinds of righteousness and how that relates to this broader theme of holiness. It was really a summary of my book, Hands of Faith, if you want to check out some of that in more detail. Now, the video that I'm showing you here was not actually recorded at the conference, so this is that. There was nothing recorded at the conference itself and as a video, but I haven't published this anywhere, and I thought maybe it would be a good chance to share it with you all. So what I have here is a video of myself presenting and reading this paper here as I would at a conference. So I'm going to play that for you now, and I hope you found this beneficial and gives you some things to think about. Luther's contribution of the 2 kinds of righteousness, presented at the Evangelical Theological Society on November of 2022. The presentation of a Lutheran perspective on personal holiness might appear as a hopeless task. Such a discussion is fraught with difficulties, as Lutherans have sometimes approached sanctification in the spirit of reaction against a perceived error rather than through positive construction, and have done so in a variety of different directions. This has led to competing Lutheran approaches to sanctification, ranging from the popular slogan that Lutherans are, quote, weak on sanctification, to the unfortunate obsessive introspection of some of the later pietists who tend to supplant the extra-nos verdict of justification with an emphasis on inward personal renewal. The navigation between the Scylla of antinomianism and the Charybdis of legalism is often difficult. And Lutheran history has shown that the Church of the Reformation is not immune to either danger. It is my proposal that Luther's distinction between the 2 kinds of righteousness provides the best framework in which the narrow way between these twin errors can be navigated. The exclusivity of passive righteousness in determining one's standing coram Deo assures the preservation of sola fide and sola gratia, while the contention that the Christian shares in an active righteousness, coram mundo, provides a framework of Christian obedience as necessary, though not salvific. The current danger. In the last century, the tendency in Lutheran thought has been bent toward a consistent downplaying of the reality of Christian obedience out of a concern that too much talk of sanctification would override Luther's insistence on the centrality of justification by grace. There are several reasons for this. First, many 20th century thinkers in Lutheranism tended to adopt a voluntarist understanding of the divine law, where law itself is not viewed as an eternal moral standard that reveals God's own nature. Instead, the law is defined either as an epoch of redemptive history to be superseded by Christ, von Hoffmann being the major figure there, or as an existential state created between the accusing God and the sinful creature. If the law is not an objective moral standard, the proclamation of the law, especially in its third use, does not have any natural place in Christian preaching and teaching. This tendency remains in Lutheran thought today, as is evidenced by Stephen Paulson's popular series of books on Luther's theology given the title The Outlaw God. The title itself is a testimony to Paulson's central claim that God works totally outside of his own law in human redemption. Second, and flowing out of the first problem here, is the denial of the third use of the law altogether, as it is a supposedly Calvinistic doctrine. German theologian Werner Ehlert popularized this argument with his insistence that Luther only affirmed two uses of the law, and that the third was brought into Lutheranism by Philip Melanchthon, who borrows from John Calvin on this point, rather than on his own spiritual mentor. Ehlert consistently narrows the distinction between the law's essence as God's moral will and then the law's function as accusation, so that the two become nearly synonymous. Gerhard Forde, in his book The Law-Gospel Debate, erases that distinction between the essence and function of the law altogether, so that in his approach, the law is accusation. With such an identification, the law now takes on a solely negative function, as a stand-in for existential dread. Luther's Anfechtungen has become Heidegger's being toward death. The law, and therefore Christian sanctification, does not have a positive and constructive function. Finally, German thought since the time of Hegel became increasingly dialectical. For the German idealist, being, or Geist, is full of contradictions which are overcome by a greater synthesis. Kierkegaard, among other existentialist thinkers, accepted Hegel's dialectical foundations, but also rejected the metaphysical necessity of the resolution of such tensions. This reveling in tensions or paradoxes is common in Karl Barth's thought and was then applied by several authors to Luther's thinking, particularly in the popularization of the Heidelberg Disputation of 1518, a text which was hardly referenced or cited in past Lutheran history prior to the 20th century. In the distinction between the theology of the cross and then the theology of glory, German theologian Walter von Leeuwenhoek discovered a dialectical Luther that he expounded upon in his book Luther's Theologia Crucis, first published in 1929. To be clear, Lutheran theology has always had a fondness for paradox and mystery, and rightly so. However, in dialectical theology, paradox too often becomes contradiction. What has resulted from all of this is what Joel Bierman has referred to as a law-gospel polarity, rather than a law-gospel distinction, in which the law and the gospel are not only distinct in their impact upon sinners, but they are in their essence inherently opposed to one another as such. The law-gospel distinction, which is at the heart of the Lutheran confession, has become the law-gospel contradiction. In this system, nearly every doctrine has then been subsumed under the categories of law and gospel, leading to a redefinition of the atonement, the nature of God's essence and his attributes, the inspiration of Holy Scripture, and many other, if not all, doctrines. The law and gospel distinction in this existentialized form overtakes both the formal and material principles of the Reformation, creating a law-gospel reductionism that has no doctrine of sanctification at all. It is crucial, in light of this past century of development, for Lutheranism to recapture a doctrine of sanctification which is consistent with a classical understanding of law and gospel rather than this existentialist reductionist one. This does not mean merely parroting the doctrine of pop evangelicals, the Reformed, or some other Christian tradition, and then importing these ideas into a Lutheran soteriological schema. Rather, we must use the distinctions that are inherent within both Luther and the later Lutheran tradition. This is not merely an addition to, but an essential part of, the theology of the conservative Reformation. This can be accomplished by using Luther's distinction between the two kinds of righteousness. Luther on the two kinds of righteousness. It is in the same year as his often discussed Heidelberg Disputation of 1518 that Luther preaches two sermons on the topic of righteousness. The first is titled The Two Kinds of Righteousness, and the second is titled On Threefold Righteousness. It is clear that one of these sermons is a revision of the other, as both rely upon the exact same biblical text, Philippians chapter 2, and have much of the same content. There are some debates about which text came first, but for the purposes of this paper, I will not be addressing that particular question. What is most important is the consistent theology that is taught in both texts, regardless of their precise temporal ordering. So here I examine first the two kinds of righteousness, and then on threefold righteousness. As Luther begins this sermon on the two kinds of righteousness, he posits that righteousness is the solution that God has given to sin. With his great Reformation discovery, whenever that might have been, Luther begins to see that the problem of sin is resolved not by human effort, but instead by the gift of divine righteousness that is granted to sinners in Christ. Yet the problem of sin is not singular, but twofold. Theologians in the West have historically distinguished between original sin, which brings death and guilt at the very moment of conception itself, and then actual sin, which refers to the daily acts of disobedience committed by sinners. In order to resolve this twofold problem of sin, God then gives a twofold solution within a twofold righteousness. The first of these addresses the guilt brought about by original sin, and the second addresses the continuance of indwelling sin and the performance of actual sins. Luther says here that this first kind of righteousness is, quote, an alien righteousness. That is the righteousness of another, instilled from without. This is the righteousness of Christ by which he justifies through faith. End of quote. It is this first kind of righteousness that is usually referred to as a passive righteousness in contemporary treatments of the subject. And at the heart of this passive righteousness is a marriage union between Christ and the soul, which occurs through faith. By faith, there is a baptismal marriage bond by which all that belongs to Christ is granted to the believer freely. This includes Jesus' own righteousness, which, though it remains properly that of Christ, and therefore alien, it is given to the believer as a covering for sin. Unlike some common portrayals of Lutheran thought, this righteousness is not some kind of separable attribute which is taken from the person of Jesus and then given to the believer. Rather, Christ gives himself to the Christian. Luther writes, quote, through faith in Christ, therefore, Christ's righteousness becomes our righteousness, and all that he has becomes ours. Rather, he himself becomes ours. End quote. Faith brings the believer out of him or herself and out of his or her own righteousness and into Christ and his righteousness extra nos. At this point in Luther's career, there was not a strong doctrine of an exclusively forensic justification. The passive righteousness that Luther describes here, while associated with Christ, could also be said to be that which progresses throughout life, within the Christian. In some sense, then, passive righteousness is both extranos and intranos. For the modern Protestant reader, this appears to be a blending of justification and sanctification. Furthermore, the formula of Concord is explicit in its distinction between these two kinds of righteousness, as the difference between an external forensic work and an internal renovative one, as we see in the formula of Concord, Article 3. There are two questions then to be answered regarding this point. First, does Luther contradict the later formula of Concord? And then second, what exactly is active righteousness for Luther, if passive righteousness is progressive and also internal? Regarding that first question, the answer, at least to some extent, must be in the affirmative. Luther's doctrine here is the beginning of the systematizing of the relationship between passive righteousness and active righteousness, and thus should not be viewed as some kind of final definitive statement on the subject. With that being said, however, the conclusion of the later formula of Concord need not be read as some kind of total and complete betrayal of Luther's thought, as is the contention of Tuomo Mannermaa and some other Finnish interpreters. The same basic themes that appear here in Luther's sermon are foundational for later Lutheran treatments of the subject. Luther's distinction here is the ground upon which Martin Chemnitz and other second-generation reformers build. To answer the second question, let us then look at the definition of the second kind of righteousness, which is discussed in the text of the sermon itself. This active righteousness is the, quote, manner of life spent profitably in good works, end quote. Luther's focus here is on the love of neighbor, or what we would generally refer to as the second table of the law. By active righteousness, Luther means that the serving of others according to our God-given vocations or callings. He does not limit active righteousness to the second table, however, as he also mentions living, quote, devoutly toward God, as well as, quote, slaying the flesh, as aspects of this active righteousness. In other words, all of those things that are generally placed under the broader label of sanctification are, for Luther, active righteousness. If this is the case, however, this would seem to mean that the line between passive righteousness, which includes progress, and active righteousness is quite unclear. While one might simply claim complete inconsistency and contradiction on Luther's part here, I think there is more to his distinction than a simple dismissal. The key to understanding passive righteousness, especially in Luther's early thought here, is to be found in the passive spirituality that the reformer himself inherited from Johann Tauler and the Theologia Germanica. For these late medieval mystics, that Luther was often quoting and highly indebted to, Christian piety is grounded in the doing and acting of Christ rather than in excessive moral striving. The Christian grows in faith not by self-righteous discipline, but instead by giving up his or her self-will in order to be filled with Christ, who acts according to his will within the believer. This Christ-centered piety was a significant departure from the Neo-Pelagianism found in some of Luther's own late medieval nominalist professors. To summarize Luther's contention here in modern parlance, Luther is concerned not only with justification sola fide, but also with sanctification that is enacted and driven by Christ rather than the believer's own moral effort. This does not mean that the Christian makes no effort in the renovative process, as Luther is clear that the believer is quite active in his or her active righteousness. It is in the name itself, after all. However, the believer's actual doing of good deeds is only possible in and through Christ himself, who continues to grow in his presence and influence within the Christian. It is for this reason that I have used the term Christification to refer to this process rather than the more common sanctification as a reference to this internal process within the believer. Christ's own righteousness grows in its influence within the believer, and works of obedience only then flow out of this Christological reality. For Luther, then, passive righteousness is the righteousness of Jesus Christ. This includes his imputed righteousness extra nos, but it also includes his intranos sanctifying righteousness. Now, it is not my contention that we must return to Luther's own linguistic designations here, as I believe that a stronger differentiation is needed between internal and external righteousness in order to secure a purely forensic understanding of justification. This all becomes quite clear in the Osiandrian controversy, which is what leads to this stronger division between forensic and renovative acts that remains in Protestant churches of various types today. If you're not familiar with the Osiandrian controversy, Andreas Osiander was a student of Luther who grabbed onto many of those transformative or renovative phrases in Luther in reference to righteousness and argued that justifying righteousness was the indwelling righteousness of the divine nature of Christ within a person that swallows up sin. This was contended against by the formula of Concord, which distinguished between that renovative inward work and the forensic declaration of justification. Nonetheless, Luther's insights here that both forensic justification and the believer's good works are foundationally Christological at their root is one that remains essential to the church today and must remain central in any truly Lutheran doctrine of personal holiness. Now we move on to the second sermon, Luther on threefold righteousness. The second sermon, also from 1518, is quite a bit shorter than the first, and it's mostly a reiteration of the same themes. However, here Luther adds an additional distinction between two kinds of active righteousness, hence coming up with these three kinds of righteousness. First, there is civil righteousness, often referred to also as civic righteousness. And then, second, there are the good deeds of the Christian. Luther recognizes in making this distinction that external acts of righteousness are not always clearly distinguished in relation to whether or not one has faith, meaning that a justified Christian may look nearly identical externally to one without faith, who is generally a faithful citizen and an honorable neighbor. In his explanation of this first kind of active righteousness, civic righteousness, Luther speaks about, quote, manifest evil being curbed by this righteousness. He defines that as those things that are recognized as wicked by Christians and non-Christians alike. Luther here demonstrates his own consistency with the broader natural law tradition, as Luther recognizes that God's commands are, to some extent, grasped via natural reason, even apart from special revelation. Luther defines some of these evils as homicide, theft, arson, as well as open sacrilege. Just want to say that, as an aside, it's important to note that this civic righteousness does have theological elements. And so Luther is not making a very strong divorce between the first table and the second table of the law by saying that it is only the second table of the law that is governed in the civic sphere. A good example of this today may be a recent debate that arose over a public statue of Satan in a public governmental building in Iowa. And many argued that this kind of religious mockery does not have a place in a house of government, and that was agreed upon by many who do not profess themselves to be Christians, say. That kind of open sacrilege is what Luther is talking about here. So I think it's important to set some of the context, because within our modern Western context, we tend to think of that civic realm only in the sense of maybe external actions toward the human neighbor, without thinking about any kind of religious element within a more pluralistic society as we have today. Okay, so it is these manifestly wicked actions which the state has been created to punish. Along with these temporal punishments, there are also temporal blessings for civic righteousness. Luther uses the example of Naaman and the earthly blessings that God granted to the Roman Empire to demonstrate this. For Luther, this civic righteousness is exclusively that of the unbeliever, as this righteousness is not performed in faith. For the reformer, civic obedience is done out of a twofold motivation. First, there is simple self-glorification and the avoidance of negative consequences. The Christian, in contrast, is motivated by a genuine love for God and neighbor, though it is to be recognized that not every one of the Christian's civically righteous deeds is done out of such pure motives, as self-righteousness and the avoidance of consequences remain even in the believer as motivations. Passive righteousness in this sermon is the second type of righteousness that Luther explains, following this active righteousness. Unlike the prior text, he does not refer to any growth in alien righteousness here, as he is here more particularly focused upon Christ's righteousness extra nos. This is especially clear in his contrast between Adam and Christ, drawing upon Romans 5, in which he contends that through Adam we are, quote, damned by means of an alien sin, just as we are, quote, freed by an alien righteousness. Luther refers then to this alien righteousness as fully unmerited. It is a pure gift. This passive righteousness then leads to the third kind of righteousness, that is the second kind of an active righteousness, and that is Christian obedience. In this piece of writing, Luther hardly says much at all about the specifics of the nature of such obedience. He summarizes this really briefly as things like, quote, prayers, alms, fasting, finally, most beautifully of all things and elsewhere, mortify your members, end quote. Luther emphasizes that the works which comprise the Christian's act of righteousness are only those which actually have divine sanction. No one has the authority to create any kind of man-made righteous acts apart from revelation and then declare them to be good, right, and necessary. Unlike the prior sermon, this text in this sermon does not emphasize the horizontal elements of Christian obedience as grounded in service to the neighbor, which does tend to dominate contemporary discussions of active righteousness. Most likely, though, this is not due to any strong theological shift between one message and the other, but rather due to the brevity of this particular text in reference to the former. In this text, then, the threefold righteousness sermon, one has a comprehensive framework in which righteousness in its manifold biblical forms can be understood. The first kind of righteousness is a civic righteousness. This encompasses outward moral actions that externally align with God's moral law and provide the basis for civic society. This kind of righteousness aligns with the traditional first use of the law in Lutheran theology, the civic use of the law. The second kind of righteousness is that which saves. This is usually conveyed with the term justification. It is this righteousness alone that secures one standing before God, and it is wholly the righteousness of another, namely Jesus. This righteousness is received solely through faith and given solely by grace. There is a correspondence between this second kind of righteousness and then the second use of the law. The law condemns in order to lead one to Christ, that one might receive the passive righteousness by faith, wherein the believer fights against the corruption of the sinful flesh by the power of the indwelling Spirit. Like the other two, this third kind of righteousness corresponds to a use of the law, namely, the third, or the law as a guide for Christian living. Within this framework, active righteousness is posited as a necessity in the Christian life, though distinguished from the righteousness that justifies, thus securing the importance of personal holiness, while simultaneously distinguishing Christian piety from justifying righteousness. Righteousness or holiness. At this point, something must be said regarding the relationship between righteousness and holiness. As you might have noticed, the topic of holiness at the beginning of this essay has led to a discussion not of holiness really at all, but instead of righteousness. This was not a mere oversight on my part, but instead it was an intentional choice. In some ways, it is necessary to begin with righteousness rather than holiness, simply because Luther does not give us the distinction between two kinds of holiness, but of righteousness. However, later Lutheran thought does make such a distinction between these two kinds of sanctification. The broad sense of sanctification, which is positional, and then we have the narrow sense, which is transformational. In other words, the latter transformational element is what people tend to use the term sanctification today to refer to in theological circles. In order to explain the relationship between the two kinds of righteousness and the two kinds of holiness, something must be said first about that relationship between righteousness and holiness a little more generally. Though this essay is not the place to give a thorough biblical overview of the ideas of righteousness and of holiness in their Old and New Testament contexts, two things can be said quickly regarding the use of such terms throughout the biblical text. First, holiness and righteousness overlap significantly, both in reference to God's character and to the human being's relationship to God. Second, holiness language is uniquely used to describe God and those things which are near him as set apart. The instruments of worship in the temple, the priests, and the nation of Israel are all declared holy, insofar as they have been set apart by God for particular purposes. Righteousness language tends to refer to conformity with God's ethical norms, or the law. Both terms are used in the New Testament in reference to human salvation, and both have forensic and participatory aspects. And I do have to make a quick note as I make this brief overview here. There is a significant amount of debate over what the term righteousness of God actually means, particularly in its Old Testament context. And the definition that I am giving here is closer to what is the older perspective on that issue. If you want to explore this more thoroughly from a contemporary perspective, I recommend Lee Iron's work on this subject. And if you want an overview of Iron's text that is probably a bit easier to digest, that can be found within Michael Horton's two-volume set on the doctrine of justification. And I can't recall whether it's the first or second volume that deals with the exegetical issues versus the historical issues, but I'm sure you can find that. It is common for Protestants to distinguish simply between justification and sanctification as synonyms for the positional aspect of salvation on the one hand and the transformative on the other. This leads to a mistaken notion that righteousness language is uniformly positional and legal, whereas holiness language is uniquely transformative and internal. The problem is that this is simply not consistent with the biblical data. Regarding righteousness, though Paul uses the term almost exclusively with reference to forensic justification, as well as with God's character in relationship to justification, the Apostle John speaks in multiple places very differently about righteousness as something which is to be practiced in the performance of good deeds. For example, in the book of 1 John, verses 2:29 and 3:10. Similarly, language of holiness can be used in multiple senses in Scripture. With regard to the commonly used transformative sense, Hebrews speaks about the process of being sanctified as something ongoing in Hebrews 10:14, and the Apostle Peter encourages us to strive to be holy in our conduct, 1 Peter 1:16. There are other texts, however, which do not use holiness terminology in an active sense, but instead describe something that has already been achieved for the Christian in Christ. Several texts, for example, speak about the people of God as already holy, Colossians 3:12, Hebrews 3:1, or of holiness as something that was received in the past through Christ, Hebrews 10:10. In 1 Corinthians 6:11, Paul speaks of both justification and sanctification as near synonyms. They are both portrayed as completed acts that are received in holy baptism. Further, in the same book, Paul refers to Jesus Christ himself as both the holiness and the righteousness of the Christian, 1 Corinthians 1:30. The point of all of this is that talk of either two kinds of righteousness or two kinds of holiness perhaps gets at the biblical reality of the positional and transformational elements of salvation better than the common justification-sanctification divide, which tends to limit the use of both righteousness and holiness language to one particular aspect of salvation. In the two kinds of righteousness framework, positionally in Christ, the believer has every benefit of redemption as it belongs to Christ's person and work. This includes Jesus' own perfect righteousness and holiness and immortality, among other things. Transformationally, Christ lives out his own holiness and righteousness in and through the believer, thus resulting in a process whereby the believer is gradually conformed to the divine image. The biblical emphasis on conformity to Christ, along with the broader biblical conception of reincorporation into the divine image, has led me to use the term Christification for that process rather than sanctification. In reality, sanctification language is used more often in a positional sense in the New Testament than it is in the most commonly used transformational one today. Further, this use of Christification as explanatory for this process, which incorporates both holiness and righteousness, reaffirms the Christocentric nature of the Christian life, as Luther intends in his sermon on the two kinds of righteousness. Contemporary proposals. This doctrine of the two kinds of righteousness has been revived in a significant way within the last 2 decades. Charles Arend, Robert Cole, Joel Bierman, and Gifford Grobeen have all contributed to this revival, each with their own take on and application of Luther's teachings. These authors have not been without their detractors, however. In particular, a phrase used by Joel Bierman that the two kinds of righteousness is a better paradigm than law and gospel led to accusations of heresy and departure from classical Lutheranism, especially in its Waltherian forms. Setting aside that question of which paradigm is better, which I don't tend to think is really helpful in one way or another, the popular criticism of the two kinds of righteousness as some kind of theological novelty is simply unfounded. Unlike the common theology of glory, theology of the cross distinction, this two kinds of righteousness distinction appears in Luther's thoughts at numerous points, and Luther's writings at numerous points, not just in one text, and it appears multiple times within the Lutheran confessions themselves, in both the Apology of the Augsburg Confession as well as in the Formula of Concord explicitly, Article 3. And it's consistently mentioned in Lutheran writings throughout the 17th through the 19th and even into the beginning of the 20th centuries. It is only with the rise of a more dialectical Lutheranism that such a distinction is not prioritized, though even then there are places where it is present. Thus, this resurgence of this theme of the two kinds of righteousness today is not an innovation, but simply a revival of a theological category that has only really lost its popularity within the last 100 years. However, it must also be said that there is not an exact correlation between the older Lutheran Orthodox doctrine of twofold righteousness and some of these contemporary proposals. For example, in Arendt and Kolb's book, The Genius of Luther's Theology, this distinction between the two kinds of righteousness is not merely explained as an important Lutheran theme, but instead as the nervous system of all Christian doctrine. In this rather comprehensive explanation of the two kinds of righteousness, passive and active righteousness are said to be the very core of human identity. In their words, both passive and active righteousness are necessary in order for one to be, quote, completely human. In this system, there is a very strong horizontal versus vertical divide that is definitive for this distinction between the two kinds of righteousness. Active righteousness is strictly a horizontal reality and is therefore definitive of all human-to-human relationships. It is concerned solely with this world rather than having any concern with the world that is to come. Passive righteousness is a strictly vertical reality, which is about one's relationship to God, or more properly, God's relationship to us, and it has no horizontal dimension whatsoever. Well, there's much to commend in Arendt and Kolb's treatment throughout this work and in their other writings. There is an underlying issue that drives much of their proposal, and that is their ontological commitments. Throughout their text, and in many of Kolb's various other writings as well, Kolb and Arendt demonstrate a profound distrust of classical metaphysics, particularly those of Plato and Aristotle. So, for example, Kolb and Arendt write that Luther does not consider the human person substantially, but instead relationally. They reject the doctrine of theosis in this work because it is said to be, quote, Platonic. And the doctrine of progressive sanctification is based, according to them, on, quote, Aristotle's model of holiness, whatever that means. Kolb and Arendt are committed here to a relational ontology rather than an essentialist or a realist one. This drives much of their formulation of the two kinds of righteousness. The notion of there being no underlying universal human essence as such is a common one in modern thought, as thinkers from Karl Marx to Michel Foucault to Judith Butler all reject a classical realist and essentialist understanding of humanity instead for a relational one, though all of those thinkers propose a relational conception of the human essence in a different way. Though there's not enough time here to explore all of the implications of claims like this and of their detrimental impact upon the most basic commitments of Christian belief, such as the existence of the soul and the incarnation, a clear point must be made here about these approaches from a Lutheran perspective. The Lutheran confessions themselves acknowledge an indebtedness to Plato and Aristotle. In the Flacian debate, the end of the 16th century, the theologian Matthias Flacius claimed that in the post-lapsarian state, the human essence is itself sin. Victor Strigel, a student of Melanchthon, argued in opposition to this that sin is an accidental change rather than a substantial one. The first article of the Formula of Concord defines the Lutheran position in response to this debate, and in doing so, clearly affirms the Aristotelian essentialism that Kolb and Arendt explicitly reject. According to Arendt and Kolb, the problem with Matthias Flacius's proposal was primarily in his adoption of Aristotelian categories. They criticize Flacius for his getting into what they call an alien paradigm of realist metaphysics. and getting into the, quote, swamp of joining biblical concepts and Aristotelian categories. It is apparent when looking at the Formula of Concord itself that the authors do not share this same conclusion as Kolb and Arendt. Rather than concluding that metaphysical categories should be rejected for strictly biblical ones in some biblicist sense, the formula says that this distinction between substance and accidental properties is a, quote, indisputable axiom in theology. Formula of Concord, Solid Declaration, Article 155. And then, immediately following this, the formula reiterates this by saying that this Aristotelian metaphysic is an indisputable truth about which, quote, no intelligent man has ever had any doubts. Formula of Concord, Solid Declaration, Article 156. There are simply no grounds upon which one can justly propose an argument that the Lutheran confessions reject a realist ontology for some kind of alternative relational one. Therefore, any conception of the two kinds of righteousness which is rooted in a relational ontology that rejects a classical essentialist ontology is not a confessional one. To be clear, the point here is not to say that Kolb and Arendt's insights on this matter are entirely mistaken. There's much to be commended in their treatment. And I actually am teaching on this book right now as I teach a prolegomena course, and there's much useful in the text. So there's much to be commended here in their treatment and in the relational nature even of the two kinds of righteousness. The divine to human relationship is determined by passive righteousness, and human to human relationships largely function on the basis of this horizontal active righteousness. However, these relations need not be conflated with the human essence or human nature itself. In rejecting the essence-relation distinction, Arendt and Kolb have repeated Flacius's error in swapping the essential for the accidental. To say that humans need relationships and that they are a core part of human identity can be affirmed boldly and rightly, while simultaneously acknowledging that the human essence is not identical to these relations. It is my contention that we can best use the insights of Kolb and Arendt by retaining the classical understanding of the human essence as a reality that is more foundational than relations, just as Aristotle himself does, and has a rather helpful distinction between essence and relations, as he speaks about relations as an accidental property, rather than adopting some kind of novel ontology. Okay, on this matter, something must be said finally on the horizontal and vertical distinction. While the verticality of justification coram Deo and the horizontal nature of coram mundo righteousness or active righteousness in service to the neighbor can be fairly divided and clearly divided here, both biblically as well as practically, there are some difficulties with this strict divide when it comes to the first table of the law. And as I said earlier, there is certainly a sense in which we can talk about the horizontal nature of not allowing blasphemy, for example, on a governmental public level. This still goes beyond that. So worship, love of God, and other matters of piety are undoubtedly active, yet do not appear to be strictly horizontally focused upon the good of the neighbor, except for those instances in which I just named. It is certainly true that obedience to the first table of the law does and will lead to the service of the neighbor, but it does appear to be quite clearly distinct from it. Thus, while the horizontal nature of Christian works is a good, right, and proper emphasis, as is testified to in contemporary treatments of twofold or threefold righteousness, it is not comprehensive. So my proposal regarding this is that we add a third category to this vertical and horizontal divide, and that is the category of thanksgiving. All obedience to the first table of the law is, by definition, Eucharistic, as should be the Christian's obedience of any kind at all, Worship and praise are always, for the Christian, responses to God's great acts of redemption. Within the framework of thanksgiving, then, we can acknowledge that there is a certain kind of verticality to that act of righteousness. However, this vertical activity of worship is never constitutive of God's relation to us, nor does it in any way add to the passive, alien righteousness of Christ. Obedience to the first table of the law is grounded in God's redemptive activity, and it is only done in light of justification through faith. This is attested to by the Lutheran liturgical tradition, in which the divine service consists in a dialogue between God and man, wherein God grants his saving benefits of absolution, the written word, the proclaimed word, the sacrament of the altar, and then the congregation responds with thanksgiving. The historic Sursum Corda confesses that there is indeed a vertical element to the active Christian life before God, as we are called to lift up our hearts to the Lord. Conclusion. With the two kinds of righteousness distinction, Luther provides us with a framework that secures the Christian's righteousness as sola gratia, and also the necessity of good works in the Christian life. The believer's obedience is the fruit of Christ's alien righteousness granted through faith, much like actual sin is fruit of original sin. This active righteousness can then be further divided, as Luther shows, into the civic works of obedience and the spirit-wrought activity which accompanies faith in the believer. Both these passive and active gifts can be accurately described as holiness and righteousness. In Christ, one receives Christ's perfect holiness and righteousness. The believer is consequently Christified as one is daily conformed to the divine image as process. Justification is always grounded upon the former rather than the latter. But the internal renewal of the Christian is no less real than the reality of divine imputation. This renewal, evident in good deeds, is largely horizontal, as it consists in acts of love on behalf of the neighbor, but it also retains a vertical element as the Christian responds to God's grace through worship and praise. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for watching and or listening. I hope you enjoyed, and make sure that you do subscribe if you have not yet, both on YouTube as well as on your podcast app. Look for the Widener Institute channel on YouTube as well. Make sure you subscribe there to even get further content from our other fellows. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.